Welcome back to another episode of the Block Runner Podcast. I'm your host, William, always here with your co-host, Iman.
What's going on, dude?
And on sticks, we got TJ.
Hello.
And finally, joining us today, we got Danny Yang. He's the co-founder of Onchain Monkey, Metagood. Welcome back, dude.
Hey, guys. Great to be here.
All right, dude. So, we were trying to have this podcast this recording last Friday, but we had a little technical difficulties. And
nature, dude.
A lot has happened over the last couple of days in the Ordinals ecosystem.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's definitely like a ramping up happening, like a
resurgence.
Across all ecosystems within the Ordinal space, I guess. So definitely a lot to talk about.
The fees too.
Yeah, the fees.
Picking up.
Yeah, which is something I think that was like the last thing we were kind of getting into a bit before like the blackout occurred. As kind of like your predictions so we'll get to that. And maybe not predictions, but like you have like a gut hunch, I'm sure, like the rest of us do. At some point, most likely we're going to end up breaking Bitcoin or something along those lines. So how do we react and what are we going to do in that scenario?
Yeah, and before we get into like the deep stuff, apparently, Danny, you've been spending the last decade in Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And so we want to learn a little bit more about that. So could you give us a little bit about your background and how you got into Bitcoin so early on?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. I guess many years ago, I got my computer science PhD at Stanford, and I was really into basically artificial intelligence, AI, and big data, and what data technologies enable in the world. And also, I being in Silicon Valley, I got the kind of the startup entrepreneur bug. So I was doing startups for a number of years. I actually finished Stanford back in 2005, so this is before Bitcoin. But while I was at Stanford, also I met one of my good friends. Bobby was a Stanford alum, and we were classmates at Stanford. And he's also the brother of Charlie Lee. So the three of us used to hang out. This was during the .com boom days, actually, pre-Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Bitcoin, I guess, surfaced, a couple years later, kind of Charlie was the one who got into it first. Then he got his brother into it. They were mining Bitcoin, and of course Charlie created Litecoin. And then Bobby wanted to start a cryptocurrency exchange, and actually around the same time I started mine. So basically, I started a Bitcoin exchange in 2013. It's called MaiCoin, MAICOIN, and it's today it's doing well. It's the largest crypto company in Taiwan. It's based out of Taiwan, because back in 2013, actually, it was also very like the thing you cared about for Bitcoin then was, Bitcoin was the main thing, was how do you buy and sell Bitcoin with fiat, right? And kind of challenge for Bitcoin even today is, well, how do you work with the banks and the regulators on the fiat side of it, right? So in Taiwan, we had good connections with the banks there. So that's why we launched from there, and it's been doing well since then. I started another crypto company, also focused on Bitcoin initially, called Blockseer, analyzing. So again, one of my passions is actually data science, AI. So analyzing Bitcoin, this public ledger, right, of transactions, and that was Blockseer. So we're one of the early and first Bitcoin analytics companies to help look at what's happening on this public network. And then also when Ethereum launched, we did the same for Ethereum. So basically say we were kind of the first explorers. We actually made one of the first explorers for Ethereum back when it launched, and I sold that company in 2018. And then basically 2.5 years ago, I started the current company Metagood, basically focused on tokens in general are actually a great tool for networking, like building the network is very powerful. Building a community, we're all part of the Bitcoin community, right? That's the kind of biggest crypto network. And then Ethereum also was created, actually kind of, you could say, splintered off from Bitcoin for its reasons, which is to create a kind of smart contracting network, and that enabled things like ERC20, ERC721. But now the exciting thing is, Ordinals has added power back to kind of the original network, and my interest in kind of creating. So Metagood, this current company, is, well, how can we, leverage crypto, to empower networks and empower communities? And we launched Onchain Monkey as, one of these. But also in terms of art, right? Art is actually really interesting. Art is also, kind of community driven thing, right? What art people like, and crypto art is this new thing, on blockchains, and it took hold on Ethereum, right, the last couple of years, and now it's starting to take hold on Bitcoin via Bitcoin Ordinals, right? This new protocol for digital artifact, which is this new medium, for art on Bitcoin, and actually it's broader than that, and it ties into many things, including, I mean, on the Block Runner podcast, you guys talk a lot about the different aspects of ordinals, right? So yeah, great to be here to discuss these things.
Yeah, that's great. I'm curious. Back in 2013, and when you and the guys were like looking into Bitcoin and talking about Litecoin and all that, did you guys have a background in cryptography to allow you to quickly jump into this ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a great question. So 2013. So going back to, I guess, also building community, I also started the Stanford Bitcoin meetup back in 2013 to build community around Bitcoin. And it's who do you attract back then? Actually, it's mostly basically the early entrepreneurs and the tech folks, like, who started actually many of the Bitcoin companies you know of today, and some that have gone out of business. So it is very much, I would say tech heavy, whether you understand networking or some of the crypto things. What is actually really nice about Bitcoin, or elegant, is that the white paper is very short and actually very accessible by anyone who spends time to read it. You don't need to be a crypto expert to understand how Bitcoin, UTXOs, the Bitcoin transaction, and the blockchain works. Like the high level ideas are actually pretty clear. It's actually not till Ethereum came out with the yellow paper that you kind of need to be really technical to understand how Ethereum and the yellow paper works. So I would argue that Bitcoin, you don't need to be to get to the level of actually doing something. You don't need to be the cryptographer. However, the PSBTs and like all the different signatures are actually also the power of Bitcoin. So there you do need some depth in cryptography.
Yeah, the reason why I ask is because I remember first hearing about Bitcoin sometime between 2012 and 2013, and I blew it off, just as most people did. Whenever you learn something new, you kind of tend to blow it off. And not until I had a good understanding of cryptography, public and private key, like how all that stuff works, that's when I had conviction, like completely, like 100% conviction in the value of Bitcoin. And so I was just curious if I guess you either have to have like an economic understanding of like the value of Bitcoin that's outside like the technical bounds to really have that conviction. And so that's why I was asking, is like, how did you guys, decide to spend time on something that was relatively new and didn't have like clear adoption and all that stuff? So
totally, yeah. Very few people use Bitcoin back then. There were interesting stories of kind of the first use cases, or actually how people first even purchased Bitcoin. The funny thing is, back in 2013, you could actually go to any Walmart and buy Bitcoin at the cash counter, where you do Western Union, all those services. And now, obviously, you can't do that anymore. That didn't last very long, but it was actually pretty convenient. You just go to the cash counter and buy some Bitcoin.
Right. Yeah. So like the origin story is interesting in regards to like our follow-up questions in with ordinals and how you were able to contribute so deeply into like the development of the ordinals ecosystem in terms of like recursive and all the stuff that you came up with. So I was just wondering, what is it about the ordinals like development that Casey came up with? What was it about that really enabled like this whole kind of resurgence of building on Bitcoin again?
Yeah, actually, go back to your earlier point about just having some conviction that this thing is something of significance, and then spend a lot of time and effort on it. And when the idea first surfaced, it actually made a lot of sense that so Bitcoin, this blockchain, it's the most, decentralized and valuable, blockchain, but it only was used to secure and store Bitcoin, a fungible token, right? There wasn't this is going to be a use case outside of that. But you see on other blockchains, especially on Ethereum, you see that, people want to secure many other digital assets, right? Both fungible and non-fungible assets, on blockchains. And here, Ordinals is a protocol that lets you actually secure digital assets on Bitcoin, the Bitcoin blockchain. And that's a huge opportunity, right? And then when you look into the Ordinals protocol and see just how it uses the Bitcoin ledger to secure these other digital assets outside of, Bitcoin, a fungible token, it's actually very much, it's an elegant and simple design like Bitcoin, and it's actually very Bitcoin native, right? It uses the UTXO model of the Bitcoin ledger to actually secure, other digital assets. So I think that is super powerful and will be used, basically, by many people. And if you want to really store, like, people will have high value digital assets to secure, right? And and they will use basically, Bitcoin to do that in in the future, or even now, right? So that's kind of starting point. So we were very much, on a mission to work, to further the Ordinals protocol so that can be possible.
Did you know that we're more than just a YouTube channel? We also built Mscribe, the first inscription platform built from the ground up for the metaverse on Bitcoin. Connect your bitmap Ordinals and use our tools to bring your community into the virtual realm. Support us by joining the movement at mscribe.io. Like, comment, and subscribe for the latest alpha. Back to the video. Okay, so let's talk about Onchain Monkey a little bit and its history on Ethereum and how it led to, I guess, where it's headed towards Bitcoin. Can you take me through the 10K mint that you guys did that was in a single transaction, and talk a little bit more about like the technical aspects? Did you, like, for example, did you leverage the call data of Ethereum to do that, or how did you accomplish that?
Sure. So one thing was that, so this is back in 2021 when we launched, when we were looking at, working on, this collection. So our focus, so this is actually going back to the point about, digital assets and digital artifacts and what it means. So Ethereum, the non-fungible token protocol is the ERC 721, standard, and that is a digital certificate protocol. So it is not generally used to store digital artifacts or on-chain NFTs, right? Bitcoin Ordinals is a protocol for digital artifacts or, on-chain NFTs. So that is a somewhat also a new thing. It actually made total sense for Ethereum to start off with ERC 721 because Ethereum is the L1 smart contract chain, which hosts every, like pretty much all sorts of things, right? ERC 20s, ERC 721. Like it didn't, if you try to do everything on chain on Ethereum, it would just bog the network down. And a lot of the creative things that were done on Ethereum with ERC 721 would not have been possible at all, right? Many of the creators were able to launch, very cool art on Ethereum in the last, couple of years because they were actually on IPFS or even, on, centralized servers. The token was traded on Ethereum with the ERC 721 standard, but the actual, asset was not. So the point of us doing Onchain Monkey was we actually wanted to do it all on chain, right? So there weren't any pointers. It's a digital artifact. This was a relatively new thing in 2021. There were a few digital artifacts on Ethereum, but they were not particularly popular. And people actually most people did not even know the difference. They didn't care.
Right.
We did care. We also knew that when you do on-chain, it bogs down the network, right? So the point of this art, the art of Onchain Monkey was, well, what can you do that is a whole 10K collection, which is also its own art form, right? 10K collections, as you see, are very popular, right? They're, in fact, the highest value, highest traded, NFTs on Ethereum, right? These 10K collections. So we want to do a 10K collection that was all on-chain as a digital artifact that also did not use a lot of the storage space on Ethereum, right? So that's why we want to do a one transaction, because one transaction has severe limits on basically, what you could do, and sending one transaction will not bog down the Ethereum network. So that was kind of the parameters of, the Genesis 10K art. And, so within basically a transaction can be about 20 million gas. That's kind of upper bound. Above that, it won't be processed by by the miners.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we basically fit all that in, and we also wanted to make it an interesting collection. So it wasn't just, well, hey, there's 10,000 of the same images, or maybe there's just distributions that are just uniform, like just cycle through different variations. We want to be a very collectible distribution where some are really rare and then some combinations make interesting patterns. So the whole thing was also part of the art that is in this this particular transaction that created the collection. So that was the kind of the vision for it. And then we launched it on September 11th, 2021.
Mm-hmm.
It was also a kind of a stealth free mint, basically. I launched it and then I just tweeted it on my Twitter. Mm-hmm. And I was not much of a Twitter user before this launch. I probably had like a few hundred followers. Mm-hmm. And then it kind of spread. So what happened, I think about 2 or 3 weeks before, so basically this is September. In August, I think towards the end of August, was when CryptoPunks did their migration to be on-chain. Like CryptoPunks was one of the, they're the OG 10K collection, right, in that art form. Mm-hmm. But when they launched, right, ERC 721 didn't even exist. And it wasn't on-chain. It was basically CryptoPunks, the original smart contract was just a number. You own a number from, in that range of 10,000. Mm-hmm. So in August of 2021, they actually wrote a new smart contract that recorded all the images on chain. So, we launched, just shortly after with actually a whole collection that's on chain. So I think some of the CryptoPunks community, heard about it and they minted it. And it's kind of just by word of mouth, it spread. So it minted out, I think within a few, the Onchain Monkey collection as a free mint minted out, within a few hours that day. And then, the community kind of just has been growing organically around basically, Onchain Monkey, Onchain, the on-chain aspect of it. Mm-hmm. So then when Ordinals came out, it actually made sense also to them. And we were educating them who are actually primarily an Ethereum community to learn about Bitcoin, to learn about possibly Ordinals and how digital artifacts on Bitcoin can be a quite significant thing.
Mm-hmm. And last question on this whole Ethereum kind of saga here. Can you clarify for me where exactly you store these images? I'm just very curious on like where it's stored.
Yeah, so this is actually kind of the cool thing too about how this works, right? You can store individual images, or you can actually generate the images, right? So generative art is about generating a bunch of art from basically an algorithm or program. So the images, well, first we use the SVG format because it's also very compact, yet it's it scales to any resolution. But we actually wrote a program. The smart contract on Ethereum is a program that basically executes and then returns programmatically the 10,000 images. So the images individually are not stored, but basically they're created on the fly.
I see. Gotcha.
When you access it. Yeah.
Okay. That makes more sense. Yeah, because I wonder, the underlying motivation to at the time when, well, I guess at the time in 2021 during the transition between CryptoPunks being, these certificates to being on chain, there wasn't a mania yet, right? And so I think the motivation to going on chain was just purely for like the ethos. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think for CryptoPunks, people already valued the art. CryptoPunks were already quite valuable before they did this separate smart contract to record it. And the market actually didn't really appreciate on-chain art that much. There was art blocks. So art blocks actually is kind of it's focused on art. They also store it on chain in the way that's possible on Ethereum. But for the most part of the market for Ethereum NFTs, and 10K collections, most of them use the protocol, the ERC 721 protocol, which is a pointer to either a centralized server or to IPFS. Right? So that wasn't, and because it's done this way as kind of standard, it's actually hard to tell the difference when you look at an NFT on Ethereum, whether it is an artifact or a certificate. So, and the market is new, right? So it's a young market. People are kind of learning the different use cases of NFTs and different form factors NFTs. And so, here, today we're also discussing, the different form factors on different chains, and then within the, or across the chains, how NFTs are, what's the right medium for any particular, art or NFT. And I think what Bitcoin Ordinals brings is basically, it's for the digital artifact, and in particular, the timing of launch of Ordinals makes sense basically in 2023 because people started understanding, digital artifacts and on-chain NFTs. If Ordinals had launched back in 2021, I don't think it would have had that much of a following because people didn't. The market didn't really exist yet for on-chain NFTs, and also the creators who knew how to do on-chain NFTs, there weren't many of them, so there wouldn't have been much activity at all on Ordinals. And we're seeing that even now, like, there hasn't been that much activity on Ordinals in 2023,
right?
In terms of, what's possible, right? What we think will come, as creators, and it's a learning project. Right? Creators are learning how to do, basically, Ordinals. Right? It's a new medium, right? You can't easily, basically apply what you learned on Ethereum over. You can somewhat because, people have been doing innovative things on Ethereum too. So, that's kind of excitement for what's coming for Bitcoin.
Did you know that we're more than just a YouTube channel?
We also built MetaZone, the first app store for the metaverse.
Buy, sell, and explore a new class of digital assets like our flagship game, Rovi.ai.
Support us by collecting your digital assets through MetaZone at metazone.io.
Like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated.
Back to the video.
So is it the history that you've had on Bitcoin, the reason why you are migrating on-chain monkeys to Bitcoin?
Oh yeah, I mean, I've been in Bitcoin a long time. So here's how I see the two chains. I mean, Bitcoin is kind of the chain that is best for store of value and, for long-term value. Like and for a kind of very high value goods. I mean, it is based on proof of work. It's based on basically converting energy to a value, right? That's like just pure physics, how the universe works.
Right.
Well, Ethereum is really, it is great with the smart contracting on the L1s, and it has a lot of power, right? This Turing completeness. And you can develop a lot of interesting things there. However, if you want to store something, let's say you have $1 million NFT. If you want to store that, for 10 years and you don't want to worry about it, I think, Bitcoin is the one where, for store value, it makes, a lot more sense. For example, like, even just from the fungible token side of things, right? Like for long-term kind of store value, I would think, it's Bitcoin by design, because it is also the kind of the drawback for Bitcoin is that they don't change the protocol or make upgrades or any change at all very easily. It's very stable though, and it's designed to be simple. So you can't also do very much on Bitcoin's chain, right? But in terms of long-term kind of storage and security of your assets, I think that's what you want.
Sure.
But it's been kind of the downside of that is, people have not been able to do actually, cool things on Bitcoin for a number of years, and people moved away from it, right? And here, because Ordinals is possible, we actually see a lot of opportunity to do, actually the cool things, but also still have this long-term, security. So that's what, what I think is exciting.
You mentioned that it was going to take $1 million to transition the Ethereum assets to Bitcoin. Why is that? Why is it $1 million?
Yeah, I mean, it is. So I think people also sometimes, there's a lot of depth to what you could do with Ordinals, and also what we've been doing with, Onchain Monkey. So the process of this migration we've been working on for the last year on Bitcoin. This 10K collection, format is actually, I think, actually a great, art form for crypto art, and we saw it on Ethereum. And I think now on Bitcoin, it'll be one of those actually relatively rare things. It's actually quite expensive to even create any 10K collection on Bitcoin. And to do kind of the innovative things we're pushing the boundary, I think it's particularly challenging to do. So we've been actually working on it for a number of months to get this out. So
I see.
yeah, and also to do it in the way we want to do it, it does cost a bit more. I mean, like for example, I mean, even the medium that we're using, we're using block 9 sats for a 10K collection. Right? That's also a lot more than if we just did any 10K collection, which is already quite expensive to do. I mean, look at the fees today, right? They're in the 60s, and we expect them possibly to go up over the next year. So it is yeah, one of those high costs, but I think worth the expense to create something that's as durable and long lasting as a 10K collection on Bitcoin.
I'm curious about like a little bit more behind like the thesis and mission behind Metagood, because I see a lot of parallels. Your position on the specifically where you are with Ordinals right now. And I think like where like Adapter Labs was like early Ethereum ecosystem. Like how what's your scope as far as like what you want to do to contribute to what's happening on this Bitcoin like builder space? Is it purely art focused, or are you considering how do we get like more like tokenomic ecosystem design innovations in the books, or like how do we incorporate more Web3 gaming?
Totally. I think yes. I think there are a lot of things that are possible. I think it takes time though. Where Ordinals and recursive inscriptions and being able to basically run and execute programs on Bitcoin in Bitcoin's way, basically code and inscriptions is executed on the client side, but you can still record state changes on chain, with actually the upcoming SAT endpoint and reinscription on SAT endpoints. It'll open up basically a lot of applications that can be built on top of Bitcoin. But all those will take time for people to figure out how to use Bitcoin for this. And the starting point, I think, is we are focused on art first, because that actually is the easiest to understand. Digital artifacts, on-chain art. So in our own and we're showing off with first what are some of the techniques through our own collections. Like we launched OCM Dimensions in the summer with recursive inscriptions. And then this 10K collection for Genesis will show off some of the techniques. But then for next year, we'll be pushing the Oshura, Ordinals, marketplace for highlighting basically Ordinals related collections and art, and that will be kind of both a marketplace and launchpad for curated collections. So definitely want to see more people coming to Ordinals and developing on top of Bitcoin, via these new abilities that you can have on Bitcoin that didn't exist a year ago.
Do you believe that that Bitcoin can have like a robust development ecosystem, with its limitations, or is Ethereum going to be the place where developers really have like really complex applications?
So I think that the biggest limitation is really actually fees. And that hasn't been a limitation until this year, right? Because fees were low, right, for much of the last couple of years on Bitcoin. And that actually is where then we'll see people actually, focusing more on L2s on Bitcoin, which, has been kind of unimportant because you could just do everything on L1 in the past because fees were not high. And fees are still high and low on Bitcoin this year. I mean, there are opportunities where we have pretty low fees, right? Even I think 2 weeks ago, the fees were like 3 sats per VByte, right? That's pretty great, right? So no, the answer is yes. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for developers to build on Bitcoin. There's definitely a lot more interest and money coming into basically this particular Bitcoin ecosystem of building applications, building on Ordinals, building on Bitcoin as a data availability layer. There are actually I think many options, and then actually as the L1 for future L2s. I mean, this push towards L2s has been actually on the Ethereum side too, right? Where Ethereum is now more focused on the L2 way of growing versus sharding the L1 layer on Ethereum. right? Which was kind of the original idea of Ethereum, but now it's, kind of both Bitcoin and Ethereum are, going towards this L2. So also, great, I think great opportunities for people working on Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's going to be important for like the early developers to build L1 stuff, so that maybe it makes sense to break Bitcoin first before there's like a real push to like start moving things to L2. Do you think we got to break Bitcoin before we do that, or should we as developers just start building on L2?
Well, what I guess the breaking Bitcoin is kind of it's a symbolic for meaning, I guess, just really getting into Bitcoin and where Bitcoin gets more adoption, right? Where then you actually have to build more on top of Bitcoin, as in L2 is on top of Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And but it's not really breaking Bitcoin. And Bitcoin as a store of value is actually further secured with higher fees, because the fees. I mean, when you say breaking Bitcoin, I think it really just means higher fees on Bitcoin.
Correct.
And that means higher security on Bitcoin. So it's actually it's breaking in the. I mean, it's really not breaking. It's actually making Bitcoin more secure, but also more expensive for people to use because it's more secure.
Yeah, in a certain sense, it's the same way that CryptoKitties kind of broke Ethereum, where it was unfeasible to kind of use Ethereum because it was so expensive. So it would be unfeasible to use Bitcoin for these pictures, right? To mint pictures, or to do anything on Bitcoin because the fees are so high. That I guess what I'm trying to say, is it necessary to get to that point before developers would be like, well, I can't really have a business on layer 1 Bitcoin because, maybe I'm running some sort of metaverse game where the fees can't be higher than the cost of the goods, right? So
yeah, so I think it's actually I would argue it's a feature. So the fee market is actually working properly on Bitcoin, and it's finding the right product market fit, right? For, let's say, if you're talking about art inscriptions, right, or Ordinals, for digital art, right? So $5 postcards on Bitcoin is going to be a poor product market fit, because it's going to cost you $50 to to create a $5 good, right? So but there's a great product market fit for high end, high value NFTs, right? And we see that on Ethereum and Bitcoin. Like on Ethereum, right, most of the revenue for the marketplaces and for collections too, right, they come from very high value NFT collections, right? CryptoPunk, Sporty Yacht Club, Chromie Squiggle, you name it. So that would be kind of the product market fit for Bitcoin in particular, right? It wouldn't be the $5, cheap NFT. It will be kind of the very high end, expensive NFTs, and one that people spend a lot of effort to create too.
Yeah. So it's all about product market fit. So if you're building something where like you're saying, it's $5, that's not necessarily going to be the greatest experience on layer 1, but it might make sense on layer 2.
Yeah, and even if Ordinals never was created, Bitcoin always had this issue, right? So Bitcoin was always going to be broken in that sense when you say break Bitcoin, because anytime you have more adoption of Bitcoin, you break Bitcoin in the sense of high fees. Right? The fees on L1 are always going to go up.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So is there any? I guess should there be any consideration? Because Casey Rodimer has kind of gone on a personal crusade to kind of address these issues of bloat, I guess. Specifically
with
from the
BRC20, right?
Yeah, fungible tokens specifically, because he can kind of see with the looming disruption that can cause, and it's kind of appeasing a little bit to the laser eye maxi crowd, right? Because who knows what that's going to do as far as
the laser eye maxi crowd actually also wants tokens on Bitcoin, right? If you talk to Michael Saylor, his dream is that securities, and MicroStrategy trade on Bitcoin. And that I agree with that. I think we do want more tokens on Bitcoin, because tokens have value, right? And that's also why Bitcoin has value, right? It's a token that people care about, and there are other tokens that people care about, and you want people to be using, and people will pay the right fees to secure those on Bitcoin. And it all works out in terms of the fee market. It's actually a really nice design. And I think Casey working on runes, and then the BRC20. I think these are all, synergistic to that. People are paying the fees to mint these, all these random BRC20s.
Yeah.
So, it is helping to push the, technology forwards. All right, people are paying the miners too. So,
yeah.
Did you always foresee that there was going to be this uptick in like fees in the long term of Bitcoin? Let's say like in after 2140, when there's no reward for mining. Did you anticipate this happening at least at a certain point within the next 120 years, that fees would be able to support the security of Bitcoin?
I think this halving and the next halving are actually the most critical for Bitcoin, because that's when the block reward basically drops to that level where you actually need fees to kick in to support the security of Bitcoin too. And yeah, I think we're basically, and we're seeing that happening with this particular halving coming up. We see more fees, and I think the transition from this halving to the next halving, 4 years further down the line, will be kind of that critical time where Bitcoin really becomes sustainable from fees plus a decreasing, exponentially decreasing block reward. Right, but in the past, it's really all the block reward is all what sustained Bitcoin. I think we'll see fees sustain Bitcoin, in that transition period, this transition period in the next 5 years.
Yeah, because I think the laser-eyed maxis had like a self-defeating, I guess, proposition for Bitcoin, a store of value. It's like typically you would buy a Bitcoin and you would hold on to it, right? And so you wouldn't trade it. There would be
you wouldn't pay the miners, right?
Yeah.
So miners got nothing from you.
Right.
Yeah.
So eventually their thesis would just self-defeat itself. It's no longer a store of value if nobody's moving it and the security can't support it.
Yeah.
So I think, if you were a true laser-eyed maxi, you'd be in support of ordinals, right? Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this idea of the block space being very valuable, because it is very valuable. I mean, you have very limited block space. So people are paying for that block space every year, right? That's why Ordinals is creating this fee demand, right? People are paying for block space. And there's only so much block space. And the block space, storing this block space every year is super sustainable because it's so limited. And so that, like, the data that's stored in this block space is, the most secure data. And these things kind of work together. So you're basically paying every year for basically more secure storage, which is also securing the assets. Bitcoin and other tokens are being created on the Bitcoin blockchain.
Right. I wonder if it wasn't for ordinals, what would be the thing that would be, require the demand for the fees? What would it be?
Yeah, I mean, well, there are other ideas too in terms of, one is just allocate more, Bitcoin, right? Inflate, have inflation to pay miners in the future. Or
really, that was a real proposition. Really, that was an option.
I think it had to be a consideration, right? In context of the economic doom.
The network will adapt. Yeah, I mean, because enough people have stake in this network, right, of Bitcoin, that they will figure out some solution. And it just happens, we're presented with a possible solution, or at least something that goes towards this possible solution with Ordinals. So
that's interesting. Imagine that update occurs and now there's more than 21 million possible Bitcoin. That'd be, I don't know. I feel like that'd be the end of Bitcoin. I feel like it. I don't know.
I don't think it has to be that dramatic, dude. The end of Bitcoin, but I mean, it's the end of, I guess, like this very definitive like narrative surrounding like the architected economic scheme of
the reason why I would say it'd be the end of Bitcoin is because the tokenomics didn't end up working out. It was like 21 million wasn't enough, or we didn't have a long enough runway.
The original white paper, you mean, would be,
yeah. I think it would disrupt confidence too in the security a bit. There has to be so many like economic adjustments just to maintain the I guess the incentive mechanisms.
Yeah, and ultimately, if that scenario were to play out, it would just fork. I mean, people would just maintain the 21 million cap in one chain and just have an inflation on another chain.
Yeah,
right. Well, but people go after the chain that has the most security. So
that's right.
if there's nothing securing
That's
the
true.
one chain, then it would die off too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we saw with, the other forks of Bitcoin, where right now there's one clear secure Bitcoin chain, and others are much lower.
Did you spend any time in BSV, like looking into it or anything?
No, I didn't work too much there.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because
Yeah,
you
we
know,
noticed a lot of these like ordinal ecosystem founders. They have like some roots or origins
Yeah.
within that space, which makes sense, I guess, because there's a little bit more like
developer
development.
friendly.
It was a development
Yeah,
happening.
more development, or also perhaps more open-minded, right?
Mhm.
They tried something different in the past, and now there's an opportunity to try something different again. I mean,
Mhm.
basically the ones who are like never trying anything different, then
Yeah.
it takes time to get them to try the new thing, right? Ordinals is a very new thing, right? It's not even
Correct.
at 1.0 release yet.
Yeah, and there is definitely a bit of a learning curve that we're learning ourselves, developing for the ordinals and inscription, I guess, frameworks, right? Like we've had to relearn a lot of things, actually just learn how Bitcoin works internally. And, it's just, we'd have to do the same thing whenever we first kind of like began our Web3 journey on Ethereum. Right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And even to use Bitcoin, I mean, prior to 2023, I could count the number of Bitcoin transactions I did in the last couple of years.
Same.
Because there was no need, right? And this year it's like we've made thousands of Bitcoin transactions each, right? So it is,
that's great.
It's like night and day. It's kind of pretty amazing what Ordinals has brought.
I agree. Yeah, I think I think it's definitely going to be one of the more interesting like developer spaces, just because it's so, I don't know, like technically like challenging, I guess, but like in a good way. Like you want to like solve these types of issues because you want to create as much robustness as possible, because we all see like the potential value of building an ecosystem on Bitcoin, right? It's probably the biggest opportunity we could all like commit ourselves to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we all have that shared common like understanding, like there's a lot of infrastructure left.
Yeah.
Right. And but that is the opportunity, right? Being able to contribute to something that foundational, it's appealing, right?
This is huge because someone like Iman, like personally myself, I like Bitcoin because of its elegance, but Iman, he wasn't really that interested in that. I mean, there's nothing
to me. It was just too boring at the time before Ordinals
that's very fair. Bitcoin had been quite boring. And now basically Ordinals, and one of the, I guess, rallying cries for Ordinals is, Ordinals is making Bitcoin fun again, right?
Yeah,
so
totally.
And Bitcoin was very fun, 10 years ago. I mean, that was the exciting thing. Like, what could you do with Bitcoin? Everything was basically priced against Bitcoin, and people are working on, well, what could you do? Like, Bitcoin has a scripting language. What could you do with that scripting language, right? And the last couple of years has been, well, Ethereum has, Solidity programming. Like, people were like, I need to hire Solidity programmers because, we're going to build all these cool smart contract things. And now it's like, well, we want to hire people who understand, Bitcoin PSBTs and Bitcoin shipping language. And, what could you do? Like, what kind of, marketplace can you build from PSBTs? What kind of, inscriptions can you make with recursive inscriptions and combining with, like different Bitcoin native things?
Yeah.
So,
well, that's a good segue to talk about sort of your contributions to the Ordinals ecosystem. And these are contributions that we're leveraging ourselves in order to build, the products for Bitmap and things like that. So do you want to go through some of the technical contributions that you and your team have contributed to the Ordinals ecosystem and give us some details and examples?
Yeah, I think so recursive inscriptions was one thing we championed, early on, basically recognizing that actually, doing code on inscriptions is really important, and then being able to leverage previously written code on Bitcoin, because Bitcoin block space is so, basically valuable and expensive. You want to be able to reuse, right? So recursive inscriptions ideas, if you inscribe something once, then other inscriptions can actually use that data in their inscriptions. And this is kind of like composability for programming, or for like in the blockchain space, people talk about, Ethereum is composable and stuff like that. So here you have it for Ordinals and inscriptions, that you can inscribe something and then you can use it. And so we also inscribe some of the kind of the useful libraries for art or Generavar. So like 3.js, p5.js, we inscribe those, and we use those when we create our OCM dimensions collection. It was a 3D 3.js enabled collection, and it kind of showed these powers of Bitcoin beyond just putting JPEGs on Bitcoin, which is cool. I mean that was kind of what got people going, right? Like we can actually now inscribe JPEGs, but now we can also inscribe code, and then recursion makes the code a lot more powerful. So people can build complex applications, and we're also seeing even like 3D galleries and things that call on other inscriptions that show off the inscriptions inside that 3D gallery, which is really cool.
Did you intuitively know that was possible? How did you know that you could just call an inscription and leverage it in another inscription?
So you could say that is actually a natural evolution of also coming from Ethereum, right? Ethereum, and then kind of doing NFTs on Ethereum. Ethereum is a pointer to something else, and then with Onchain, Ethereum NFTs is like pointers within the chain, right? So then it was natural on Bitcoin to be able to do that within the chain of Bitcoin, right? So basically, you could say recursive inscriptions are pointers within the chain, right, of Bitcoin. So it's kind of a natural evolution of this technology.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. It makes so much more sense now, because ultimately all these inscriptions are just pointers, except it's pointers on chain rather than to a server. Yeah. So that makes.
And the other idea actually coming from Ethereum is also the idea of a collection, right? An actual NFT collection, right? And when Ordinals launched, it's one big collection. Everyone is part of the Ordinals, collection, right? Inscription numbers were numbered, right? Sequentially. So everyone got their own number, but you couldn't create your own collection. And that was another idea that, was also, I mean, Casey had thought of it too. He had this parent-child provenance idea, but that wasn't implemented yet. Like basically, Ordinals was launched before this, the protocol was finalized. So we were also pushing for the idea of a collection standard that you could actually do collections, not just one collection, like one global Ordinal collection. So we also pushed on the parent-child collection provenance, and that. I think was released just a couple of weeks ago officially in the Ord, the Ord CLI. And people are starting to use that. And so the space though, like in terms of explorers and marketplaces, right? They're not using it just yet, but the creators can start using it. And what's nice about that is then the collections are recorded, on chain. Like these like set of inscriptions are all part of one collection. Which, prior to that, you didn't know how people knew or how people shared that information was really just off chain through, CSV files, right? Like, oh, these 100 are one collection. So with that, the parent-child collection provenance will be actually a big benefit for future creators. So I think those two are important part of Ordinals.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so thank you for those contributions, because we're intimately using all these contributions that you've bestowed onto to Ordinals, and they're very important because you establish on-chain provenance with parent-child. Recursive inscriptions is sort of like a compression algorithm to a certain extent when creating new Ordinals. So these are big things, and do you happen to be working on any other contributions to Ordinals that you think is necessary?
Well, I'd say the next big thing and it's not just us, a number of people are waiting on it, is basically the SAT endpoint. So then when you use it with recursion, basically you can record changes of state. You can also create dynamic NFTs and a bunch of things with the SAT endpoint. So I believe that's coming out pretty soon.
Do you want to go just a little bit more detail as to what that is and like how do you use a SAT endpoint?
Yeah, so this has to do with SAT numbers too, which is actually an interesting thing. I think for many new people who know about NFTs but are just learning about ordinals, like there's actually all these terms that are pretty confusing. So yeah, and we're talking about recursive endpoint. That's another new term. So I mean, there's the SAT, right? There's Satoshi, and then there's ordinal. So every SAT has a ordinal number, or you just call them SAT number. And so you can reference, and the SAT or the Satoshi is what you can own, right, by the Bitcoin ledger. And whether you follow ordinals or not, right, people own their Satoshi using the standard Bitcoin ledger. And so by referencing a SAT in your inscription, which is the SAT endpoint I'm talking about, you can, I guess the other thing I didn't talk about is so inscriptions. So you own the inscription via a SAT. So a given SAT actually can have multiple inscriptions on it. And this also is something that people have not done too much experimenting on. So like basically for a given SAT that you own, you can inscribe it once or twice or 3 times. You can inscribe it many times. And that often gets confused with, well, I thought Bitcoin block space was limited. How can you have infinite number of inscriptions on a SAT? Well, every inscription uses the same resources, whether you put it on this SAT or another SAT or put 2 inscriptions on one SAT. It's a cost of 2 inscriptions. So reinscribing does not mean you're somehow creating new space on Bitcoin. It's the same space. You're just making another inscription, but the rest of the inscription is on that same SAT. But when you do things this way, it's actually, you have another layer of programmability because the SAT endpoint is the thing that basically one person owns with the same address, which is the SAT. And you can let you change things, or rather not change things, but create new things on the same SAT. Also, inscriptions are immutable, so they never get changed. But basically the inscription on a given SAT, the latest one changes, right? Because if you can start with, basically when you inscribe a SAT for the first time, it's basically, let's say think about it in terms of like building a tower. You inscribe the ground floor of that that SAT, right? Then if you re-inscribe it, you're inscribing the floor on top, but the ground floor never changes. It's still the same inscription there. But with the SAT endpoint, then you can point to any floor, or you could point to the latest floor, and that's one of the powers of the SAT endpoint. So you can create an inscription that just points to the latest floor of that SAT.
I see.
And so that allows the creator or whoever is basically updating or creating inscriptions on that SAT endpoint, or has a power to create inscriptions for a given SAT. Or you can say the owner. So you need to be the owner of a SAT also to inscribe on it. So if you have, so I guess I explain, I guess, a lot of concepts all in one, so it might be hard to understand. But the general like new concept that could be done with the SAT endpoint is you could do dynamic NFTs. That's one, or you could record changes of state in applications. That's another. So those 2 powers will be very, very much used.
That makes sense. So basically, if you have, let's say, just a simple game, and you have a sword, and there's 3 levels to the sword, right? And so you can inscribe the 3 different levels to the sword, and then in the game's logic, you can point to the different levels based on what your character has done in the game, right?
You could do something like that. Basically, you can reference different levels of a given SAT. With the SAT endpoint, and that's a powerful new feature. It doesn't seem like much just from hearing about it, but when developers start thinking about what you could use or what you could develop with that added tool, it's actually quite powerful. Yeah. So just like with recursive inscriptions, it actually sounds pretty simple. You just point to another thing, but actually it's super powerful. So
agreed.
So yeah, we'll see a lot of this, new types of inscriptions coming out with those features. Yeah, and the thing that we've been spending a lot of effort doing. You mentioned the kind of $1 million move of getting our collection over. So our 10K Genesis inscription will use some of these features too. Actually, all of them. It'll have a lot of these. You could say, Bitcoin native techniques, and looking forward to showing that off.
Is there like a limit at all to like what we can continue to come up with as far as like inscription rule sets or inscription? I guess like individual components that eventually end up like a library of standards. Like, I mean, at some point, does this all lead to we could program anything, right? Like onto Bitcoin. I mean, I've seen, like the concept of bit VM, like out there, like Bitcoin becoming a
Yeah,
virtual machine.
very exciting.
Yeah.
Things like BitVM and rollups are very exciting. I think it'll take time, so you won't see that overnight. Like
Yeah.
it won't come out next week.
Mhm.
But yeah, in the next year or a couple of years, it's going to show a lot of power for Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Speaking of power, I have a question. What's your take on Casey Rodermore's power in terms of, like, let's say you made these contributions, you have parent child, you have recursive inscriptions. How much do you have to depend on Casey to make that update on the Ord client?
Yeah, so there, I guess that has changed over the course of the year, right? So obviously, right when Ordinals launched, right, kind of all the power rested in Casey, right? It is his, his work, right, on Bitcoin. Now that the Ordinal protocol is a lot more understood and a lot more people are working on it, it is, I mean, and he said himself, right, in many of the recent spaces, right, how he listens to the community, and it's not his will anymore, right, on the Ordinals protocol. It's really, what what the community wants, and the community already understands kind of what the Ordinal protocol on the core Ordinal protocol is, right, and then we're just, and also the things I mentioned, these are already, been developed, by Casey and others, over the last few months, and it's really, I say, the power of Casey is just kind of the timing of when it's finally finalized and released, right? Like kind of the final blessing, right? That when I say, I mean the time when basically also the cursed inscriptions and all these things will mostly be gone, right? There's going to be pure, like a block height activation at some point where we're going to have the 1.0 release. And that's going to be, relatively soon, either around the end of the year or early next year. I think that's kind of the you could say the great launch of Ordinals, right? The 1.0 release. And that's also when, a lot more companies and institutions will feel very comfortable with Ordinals. I think right now, I think your question has some merit on that. People are still worried about kind of the power that Casey has over it. But that is, I'd say, I'm not worried, because I see this 1.0 release coming up, and it's pretty clear, what Ordinals is. So it's it's basically, something that is already well established as what the protocol is, and then the work to get it to the 1.0 release is what's left, and basically that's pretty much a bite-sized, chunk of work that's happened or getting executed,
Sure.
as we speak in the next few weeks.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, the reconciliation of, let's say, a developer comes in, looks at the 1.0 Ord client and says, you know what, I think I can do this better and add other features. So do you think, I guess explain how this is going to work. If you come up with a better updated version.
So how do we do basically like BIPs with Ordinals, right? Like, the Bitcoin improvement proposals.
Exactly.
How do you do how does it advance afterwards, right? In a decentralized or in an optimal way.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would say, well, first, I don't think there needs to be too much change after the 1.0 release. So it's going to be probably one where, you won't see too many changes. And then when you see changes, then it'll be debated by the community probably for quite a bit before any changes are made.
Okay.
And then that actual process for upgrading, just like with Bitcoin, the process for the previous Bitcoin upgrades were very messy and long, and takes or rather time consuming. And a lot of people, are get up in arms, and but debate on it. I mean, the Ordinals community has been actually very healthy in how they debate things, and basically discuss improvements. So, and I'm quite optimistic in how this protocol can advance post 1.0 release.
Yeah, everything's been going pretty smooth with the comments on GitHub and all that. So I think in the future that's probably going to continue, just because it's just more organized there. So Danny, we got a few more minutes. Do you want to talk about anything that's coming up that you want the audience to know about, and or anything special about what's coming up?
Yeah, so we've been really busy working on OCM Genesis, which is our 10K collection. I think I'm quite fascinated by the 10K collection art form at crypto art. It has a lot of special. The 10K form, right, has, and basically those are like that form has kind of driven NFT adoption. Like that is the highest value and highest volume of NFTs, right, on Ethereum. And on Bitcoin, I think it's going to be quite special too, because it's going to be one that is quite expensive to pull off. And it's also one where it's, and you can have different types of 10Ks. I mean, you could have 10K awards, right, which is its own thing. But like the 10K image collection, I think is pretty special as an art form. And we've been focused on our 10K basically art of OCM Genesis on Bitcoin. So we're near completion of that. That's been actually many months of work. So we are excited to show that off. And it'll be some of the kind of the Bitcoin native features of it would be that it's done on block 9 sats, which are special for historic reasons of Ordinals, and also doing parent child as using that provenance feature, and these are all kind of also challenging to do for a 10K collection because it is so large for the way that you had to create parent child collections, and then also we did on sequential sats to really highlight the number, like the token number of the Genesis collection. Like my Genesis is number 3, so it's on a sat that the last 5 digits, they all get zeroed out, and then it'll be 00003. So you can tell which Genesis is inscribed on that sat very clearly. And we also did reinscription. So that's another thing that we did, where we inscribed the 10K collection of Genesis. We then reinscribed a 10K generative art collection on the same sats. So there are 2 collections that, and that 10K generative art collection is not just any one. It's actually one that we inscribed. So Genesis was when we inscribed the art on Bitcoin in February, and then in March we inscribed this generative art collection, and it is one that uses the DNA or the traits of Genesis to create this abstract art. And so the two fit together very nicely on this sat that we did this 10K collection on.
So that brings up another question. So a lot of the provenance work that you did with your collection, like a parent-child, and you did this in February before things were like solidified, right? So
that's right. It took basically from February until now, right, November, so 9 months to actually finish or complete, right, this collection, because the Ordinals protocol, we had to also work with the Ordinals protocol to make it possible to do these things.
Okay, so the actual like inscriptions were completed in February, and were you?
So the images were inscribed in February,
right?
The actual sats from block 9, right, are inscribed now, that do recursion to get the images from the February and March inscriptions.
Gotcha.
And also parent-child for the provenance of the February and March inscriptions.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes a lot of sense now.
Yeah,
that's really cool. Yeah, so basically you leverage being super early as your early inscriptions, and then you just kind of point back to it and say, we were at least February early, which is huge. Yeah, that's awesome.
And then we can leverage basically basically what we were talking about with how to use Bitcoin, right, in this efficient way, and also way in the future when fees are high, right? Fees are going to be above 100 sats per byte, right, next year, probably for many long stretches of time. So it's going to be quite interesting to see.
Have you heard from any other like Ethereum ecosystem NFT founders who are kind of like they're watching what you're doing with on-chain monkeys and maybe like waiting on the sidelines to see how everything rolls out, and maybe they want to kind of follow in your footsteps? Have you heard anything like that?
Yeah, and in fact, the way we're doing the migration, we're actually creating a Ethereum smart contract interface to make the Teleburn provenance very clear. Because right now the Teleburn provenance is more clear on the Bitcoin side because Casey added the Teleburn address for Ethereum directly on ordinals.com, right? So for every inscription, you can see the Ethereum address. But on the Ethereum side, if someone actually did the Teleburn, it just looks like on OpenSea. If you look, it just looks like someone sent the NFT to some other address. It's not super clear. In fact, it's not clear at all that it was Teleburn. So yeah, we're adding basically some tools on both chains to make it more clear from a provenance perspective and easier for future creators to do this.
Sure. Yeah, that's cool. All right. So there's a couple of things I want to have you come back on to talk about all these other aspects. I wanted to talk about bitmap. I wanted to talk about this digital matter theory that we're kind of building to a certain extent. It kind of leverages on-chain data to create new tokens, fungible and non-fungible tokens based on Bitcoin's block data. And I think there's one other thing that I wanted to talk to you about. I can't think of it, but Danny, I want to thank you so much for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure, kind of getting the history of Onchain Monkey.
And I'm really hoping you continue to find your next, I guess, paradigm project to tackle, because it seems like anything you dip your toes into, you're pushing the boundaries of innovation forward.
Yeah,
for all of us, really.
Yeah.
So it's never stop doing what you do, because I think the whole space is
better because of it.
Yeah, correct. So I think it's tremendous what you've done so far, as from a human achievement perspective.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think you deserve a lot of credit for that. Maybe in the future, once we all look back and this thing is like a multi-billion-dollar ecosystem, like, hey, how did all this happen? I think a lot of fingers are going to point back to, what you guys have done as a team, and specifically all these new little components that developers like us get to leverage as a result.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me on it. No, it's all of us who are building in the space now, and definitely these are kind of exciting early days, for our protocol. So yeah, thanks again for having me on.
No, I appreciate you. All the links will be in the description, guys. Thank you guys for watching. So yeah, Danny, we're gonna hit you up to come back on, talk about the actual migration, and
get deep into the data layer for sure,
and talk about other stuff that's happening on Bitcoin, because there's a lot.
Yeah.
All right, Danny, thank you so much. We'll catch you soon, man.